No, that's okay.
I think I will start recording anyway, and perhaps we can also just make a brief introduction in the end, and then I can cut it and put it at the beginning or something like that. Yeah, so I don't know. Is there some topic that you just had like kind of in your mind a lot in the last couple of days?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, actually. Yesterday I did discuss things connected to religion and God and Christianity with some people. So that's one thing. But yeah, what about you?
I've just now remembered that I have been thinking a lot about kind of, I don't like to call it this way, but the mind-body dichotomy, that somehow human beings have a material part, kind of the body, and it has certain needs, and also they have a rational part, or a soul, or a mind, however it has been called, and this also has certain needs, and how these two relate to each other and kind of what effect it has on your thinking if you put more emphasis on the one part or the other part, or how to kind of find a right balance between them. This has been something that has been troubling me a little bit lately.
That's a very interesting topic. I actually discussed something like that also yesterday, connected to, for instance, transgenderism, which some argue could be linked to a very problematic philosophy about the relationship between mind and body, or soul and body. And yes, those are very interesting subjects and important, because they concern the very nature of human identity.
Yes, I think, yes, I think it's also interesting to look at the transgender question as one of the current manifestations, if you want to call it like that, of this huge question, which I think is almost as old as philosophy itself, because you can look at it that you are kind of a consciousness, and the body is just a vessel or a tool of the consciousness, and isn't really connected to it in some fundamental sense. And so you can just kind of operate on the body and change it so that it has a different outward appearance, and then that would be okay from this point of view, because it's just yeah, it's just like a machine made out of flesh. But you could also look at it that the body has certain characteristics or needs, or a nature of its own, and cannot just be disconnected from the mind or the rationality, or however you want to call this other part. So I think it's a nice example of this general question.
Right. I could also mention that in the philosophy of mind discussion, or in academia, in that section of philosophy, there's a lot of discussion and disagreement about what is called the mind-body problem. How should we understand the mind and the body in relation to each other? And there are different positions there. And what you were talking about, that reminds me of this mind-body dualism. This position that, for instance, René Descartes, that famous French philosopher, argued for, that you are really a spiritual substance, the soul, and then the body is sort of an external thing that is attached to you, similar to, as you described, some sort of vessel or perhaps a vehicle. So you are, properly speaking, just that spiritual substance, and then the body is something external attached to you. And I think this is also central to different forms of Gnosticism, this idea that the material world is evil and the spiritual world is good, and it's really the soul which is what is valuable inside of you. So the body is simply some bad thing that you should really try to be released from. I think also Pythagoras, that Greek mathematician, and his followers also embraced such a notion. And I think this can be seen as some sort of idea found in transgenderism as well, as I think we discussed this also at one time, that they seem to think that your identity is determined above and beyond the body. So what you feel is your identity, determines your identity, rather than what the body tells you. So we sort of see a reflection of that philosophy there as well. But yeah, I would completely disagree with that position. I would embrace more you could say the Aristotelian position, that the soul and body are essentially part of a whole. I would say that the soul is the form of the body, if we use these hylomorphic terms of material things having a form and matter. Form is the principle which animates and organizes the matter, and then matter is what that thing is made of. So that would be the classical Aristotelian notion, that they are essentially part of a whole. The body is part of your identity. So yeah, that is, broadly speaking, some of the important things to consider in this whole discussion, I would say.
Yes. Interesting point that you brought up there, that the transgender activists, I would say, because these are the ones that are heard often, they say, yes, that the way you feel determines your identity and not the body. It reminds me also a little bit of, I think, this Platonic or Neoplatonic idea that the body is kind of like a prison into which the soul has been dropped or has fallen, and now has to kind of endure being in this body for a certain time before it will be freed from it. And it's interesting, it reminds me also a little bit of this conversation that I had with this antinatalist. He seemed to have a kind of similar view, that I, as the conscious subject, am somehow stuck in this deficient body, and I am dependent on all kinds of things that are external of my control, and so I can suffer. And this is a very imperfect creation according to his understanding, and that's why he thinks it's not good the way reality is. So I think, yeah, this problem is kind of widespread, and it started really to trouble me when I was reading the meditations of Marcus Aurelius together with a couple of other friends from university. And I realized that also the Stoic philosophy has this disregard for the body, that the soul is that which is important, or the rationality, I think they typically call it more by the name of rationality. And the body is basically, doesn't have any value in itself, and also the desires or needs of the body are not really important. Important is only to live according to reason, and everything else is not important. And I felt that there is really, that's the point where I am kind of having trouble with the Stoic philosophy, because I like many aspects of it, but I cannot really follow in this step to just disregard the needs of my body and also the body of other people. And there is really the difficulty, and talking a lot, but one more point. I have also heard once the idea that in Christianity there is this idea that I don't know exactly how, but when Jesus comes back, then every person will be resurrected with their body. It's not just the soul, but the body also. And some people have even said that the whole idea behind Christianity would fall apart if this were not true, that the body also is saved. And I think this has to do exactly again with this point that many people feel that they have this consciousness or this soul, this rational faculty, but also they are not willing to just disregard their body as being either unimportant or useless or even evil. And so I think that's one important distinction perhaps between Christianity and Stoicism.
Interesting points there, and I would completely agree. Since, as you said, there is this difference between the Stoics and Christianity. I didn't actually know that the Stoics had such a view of the body specifically, but yeah, that's interesting, and that shows some of the differences. And yes, in Christianity, it's very central, the idea of the resurrection of the body. It's contained within the Apostolic Creed, the idea that all our bodies will be reunited, restored, and reunited to the soul at Judgment Day. And that would be the proper condition of human beings, so that when human beings die, the soul and the body is separated. You will have the soul, and if that soul goes to heaven, it would be great for the soul to be with God in heaven, but it would be complete. It would still want to have the body so that the whole is there. And that's why it makes sense that there will be this resurrection at the end of the world. And if you look at other philosophies and heretical movements like Gnosticism, they would completely reject that. They believe that, oh no, the body is evil, matter is evil, so they would completely deny such a notion. So here we see a very interesting phenomenon, that we have Christianity, which does not deny the material world, but rather has an harmonious understanding of the relationship between the spiritual world and the material world, so to speak.
Yes, I think that's indeed interesting. And I thought then, as I was thinking about these things, that perhaps this is one of the reasons why Christianity spread and became more and more popular amongst the entire society of basically of the Roman Empire, and why Christianity and not Stoicism became the prime philosophy or religion or ideology of this society, because there is some fundamental truth that you cannot disregard the consciousness or the body and only focus on one. There is something somehow flawed about doing that, or somehow yeah, there is some, it kind of doesn't feel right, at least to me, and I think to many people. And I also think it's interesting to look at this idea, or at least that's how I would look at it currently, this idea of the resurrection, that it's not so much having to do about the physics or the material behavior of matter, and more to acknowledge the fact that both the soul and the body are important, and not only one of them. I guess you would disagree, but I think that's an interesting thought for me nonetheless.
Yeah, it would be said, according to Christianity, that both have value, and one should take care of both, even though obviously in Christianity the soul is far more important than the body. Jesus says in the Bible that, okay, if you gain the whole world, what point is that if you lose your own soul? So it's clear that one is more important than the other, but they both have value and should be taken care of. So yes, those are very interesting notions, and one can also see more generally speaking in Christianity that one has this interesting elevation of this material world, that the spiritual world enters into creation and elevates it. For instance, the famous dogma of the incarnation, that God became man and took to himself a human soul and a human body, Jesus Christ. That also is a very striking confirmation of this doctrine, that the material world isn't evil. It isn't evil to have a body and a soul. It's actually a good thing. And even God himself united to himself such a nature. God became flesh, this famous biblical passage. And also in Catholicism, in particular, the sacramental system, that you have baptism and confirmation and the Eucharist, and all of those involve material things in some way or another. In baptism, you have water. In the Eucharist, you have the body and blood of Christ being substantially present, and in other things, you have visible material things accompanied by invisible. Great union between the spiritual and the material is found in Catholicism, and it's very beautiful, I would say. Whereas in Gnosticism, in as you would say, stoicism, and other philosophies, this kind of approach or notion seems to be very absent.
Yes, I think this is also a very valuable point that you mentioned here, that the spiritual dimension somehow enters into the material dimension and thereby elevates it or makes it more valuable or better. And I also like the notion, as you said, that there is a hierarchy of value, that the soul or the spiritual dimension is more important, but that doesn't mean that the other dimension is completely unimportant. It doesn't mean a absolutist focus only on the soul, but it just means that in a direct competition, the soul is more important than the body, but the body also has a value. And I think, to my mind, this seems a very this seems far more fitting or kind of intuitively right than the mere assertion that only the soul has value and the body is irrelevant. And yeah.
Right, exactly. And also just also elaborate on the point, you also have in Catholicism the notion that grace perfects nature. And this is the idea that when God tries to, or when God actually, because he's all powerful, he can do all things, spiritually help someone, give someone aid, that is grace, that will perfect nature. It doesn't try to destroy nature, but actually perfects it. And this is a very interesting notion, because one interesting philosophical argument, to be brief about this, but one interesting argument for Catholicism is that it takes into account human nature, that we are social animals, we have this temporal order on earth to concern ourselves with, and that's why you see that the Catholic Church has this temporal dimension to it, and has this idea that there is a way that the society should be united to the church and to spiritual things, whereas Protestant makes this huge separation between the church and an earthly society. So that's just a side note, which I also find very interesting. But yes, I think this is very important, very valuable, and very beautiful philosophically as well as theologically. The idea to have the spiritual and the material both being good, and that it is good for them to be united. The spiritual should always have the primacy, of course, because that's the most important thing, and it should, but it should nevertheless be united to the bodily, to the material, and the material should follow the spiritual and not have a separation. And the idea of the spiritual entering creation, elevating nature. For instance, in the baptism, we have the idea of the new birth, that the human person is born again, becoming a new creation. All of that involves the material becoming something better, something improved, something new, instead of just trying to destroy the natural or the material. So yes, I think those are great things. And as we have discussed before, we see that when one tries to reject that notion, that there are problems both to one extreme with Gnosticism and all that, which tries to deny the material altogether, treat it as evil. That is, of course, wrong. And also the other extreme, pure materialism, that only the body matters, that only the senses and the sensual, the appetites are what are important. That's also very destructive. And I would say that in the modern era, we see you could say, in a sense, we see both extremes, because you have transgenderism, which says that no, it's only the spiritual which defines identity. But then you also have all the materialism and hedonism and all the people caring about sensual appetites in general in society. And so it's a very interesting distortion there. But yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to go into that direction, because now that you mentioned this, I actually thought it's very fascinating. There is in Eastern philosophy, there is this symbol of with the circle that is kind of divided into a white and a black half. And according to Peterson, these two things stand for two opposites, and always in the center of one there is a little dot of the other color. So in the center of the black side there is a white dot, and vice versa. And what Peterson talked about is that in certain human tendencies, when they are driven to the utmost extreme, then out of this extreme emerges again the opposite tendency. So thinking about this idea of because I too think that our Western society has become more and more materialist, as the importance of religion, in most cases this was Christianity, has declined more and more, and people have focused more and more on material things, on like the satisfaction of personal desires. Basically the whole economy is based on the capitalist idea that people will work because they want to fulfill their own desires, and you need money to satisfy your appetites, and it is considered good to satisfy your appetites as long as you're not directly harming another by doing so. And so this trend has been more and more a focus on the material. And then out of this, all of a sudden emerged this idea that I can change my body to be whatever I want. Basically, kind of this idea that only the spirit defines what I am and not the matter. Which is very funny how this idea emerged out of this hedonistic, very materialistic culture.
It's an interesting paradox, I would say, and some have argued that humanity is some sort of very strange mixture of some form of neo-Gnosticism and some form of materialistic, scientistic hedonism, where the material, the natural is everything. It's a very strange distortion. It doesn't have this harmony as you would say there is in Christianity. And also I also now recall An interesting example from the past, which sort of looks a bit like that. The Dualists in the 13th century, which were also called the Cathars, a group of a heretical movement in Europe in the 13th century back then, who believed that the material world was evil, spiritual was good, so the basic Gnostic doctrines, and that you must essentially liberate yourself from the material, from the body. But at the same time, it seems that they said that, well, only a few can actually do this and live this extreme life of denying all the body totally, completely. And so the majority of human beings, they should sort of just delight in bodily pleasures and sensual appetites. So it sounds very strange, but it actually had this paradox where, yes, they denied the material, it was all evil, but at the same time, they gave up the majority of the people to just do whatever they want with that material delight. And I think a possible interpretation of why that was might be that when one categorically discards and disregards all material, all the bodily, one would also not be interested in looking at obligations that you have in that bodily context. Because if you believe that the body and the material world is good, you would also take care that you treat it in a good way and proper way. But if you just completely disregard it whatsoever, you sort of become indifferent to what happens to it, because no matter what happens to your body, it's evil anyways. So I think this philosophy in an interesting way undermines any idea of an obligation, a virtue that concerns the body and the material. And therefore, you can actually, in a very strange, paradoxical way, have both this hedonistic license as well as the idea that matter is evil. Perhaps this was more of another topic, but I thought that was an interesting example of how the rejection of the true position on this matter leads to all kinds of distorted views and notions.
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting and valuable example in the context of this idea that we are trying to work out. Because I agree that when this is also something that has troubled me a little bit with the Stoic philosophy, at least as it is presented by Marcus Aurelius, because when you say that the material world is completely irrelevant, yes, then you also cannot care in the least for what happens physically to other human beings, because that's completely irrelevant. The material world is evil anyways. So the only thing that you should care about is to have communion with other rational souls. To perhaps you can talk to a person who is also rational or also in the same search in some sense as you are, and then a conversation with this person would be valuable, because it would be like one rational soul interacting with another rational soul. But what happens to the body of all these people is irrelevant from this point of view. And so I guess that you are right, that in this sense, it is actually possible to have these two modes of existence kind of parallel to each other. And it also reminds me of this notion that Marcus Aurelius talks about a lot, and I think it somehow fascinates me, so that I still can't completely make up my mind about it. So this notion is the idea that a human being has an animal part and a divine part, which is the soul or the rationality. And I think you could say that some people are more focused are more focused on their animal part of themselves, and they just follow their appetites, do whatever they please in the moment, and don't really care about rational thoughts or a cohesive worldview. They just do what they want. And these are like lower human beings, like animal kind of human beings. And then you have others who are far more concerned about the rational part or the soul or the divine aspect of them. And these in turn disregard the animal aspect of themselves. And this kind of creates such a split where you have like people who are like animals, and then you have people who are almost like God. They are very much unconcerned about their own pleasure or pain, or they don't desire anything, and they seem to have a sort of independence, because when you don't have any bodily needs, then you are also not dependent on anything in the material world. So yeah, what do you think of that?
Interesting points. And to the latter point you were making, that reminds me of the Buddhist monks who treat the idea of desire, desiring things, and existence as inherently bad. And their idea of heaven or nirvana is actually the lack of existence, that it don't exist at all. That all of it is just it's just bad, so to speak. And this was also something that Arthur Schopenhauer, that German philosopher, also took up, the idea that existence and desire are all bad. And it seems to have been an integral part of his very pessimistic philosophy on the world, that the world is so bad, and he was a real pessimist. And yes, that leads to false notions and conclusions. And also another point which I just thought about, when one has the view that the material is evil, the body is evil, also the one inevitably finds the idea that you should reject procreation, that having a family and having children is bad, because that means that you just create more souls sort of captured in, so to speak, imprisoned in bodies. And that's a very bad thing. And that's exactly what the dualists in that 13th century also held, that it's wrong to marry and wrong to have children and start a family, because that just means that you create more souls imprisoned in evil bodies. And as you were talking about antinatalism earlier, where there we see a very interesting connection to that, because then you treat material life as evil, so it's bad to have children. And that's also, I think, an explanation for why also the dualists, in this very strange paradoxical way, supported sexual activity which were not about procreation. And therefore, of course, this was very at odds with Catholic morality and Catholic virtue, and even the natural law. So that is also an interesting connection to modern society, which also rejects the family and procreation, both the antinatalists and generally speaking with the sexual revolution of the 60s, where sexual activity was more and more about pleasure and less about actually a family and getting children. So yes, you see all these interesting but also destructive notions, and how they flow from a view of this metaphysical issue.
Yes, and it's also very interesting when you hear of these historical examples, and then you compare them to current day philosophical notions, that these things kind of keep reoccurring. They seem to really be part of the struggle of being human, that these ideas keep coming up, maybe with a different name or slightly different form, but essentially the same philosophical notion. And yeah, it's very interesting. I have also a thought on this. I'm a little bit afraid I can't formulate it perfectly, but I will try. And the idea is that perhaps from the point of view of a society, it even makes sense biologically or evolutionarily speaking, to have a majority of people who procreate and basically just live, and then have a minority who kind of do not live or enjoy these pleasures themselves, but are instead occupied with organizing the structure of the entire society, so that the entire society as a unit functions and keeps on existing. And so it might be even in some way evolutionarily sensible to have a minority of people who disregard their own pleasure and think about very high abstractions and kind of the function of the whole cosmos or society or the world, and then to have the larger part of society who do not dive into these kinds of thoughts, but just live and have children and work and eat and drink and enjoy life, basically. And so one thought in that context is, I'm not entirely sure, but to my knowledge, the rite of circumcision originated in Egypt. And it was there only high priests and officials of the state who were circumcised. And it's kind of a manifestation of this idea that if you come into this position of controlling large portions of the society, then you should not be primarily concerned about your own pleasures, but more about these big notions and ideas. And therefore, you should be willing to sacrifice the bodily pleasure and then have more of this intellectual life. So yeah, I think I didn't formulate it too bad, my idea.
Interesting thoughts you brought up there. Yes, in the Catholic view, it would be very similar in that one would say that perfection, if you really want to be perfect, you should actually live in a celibacy and virginity your entire life, and it's also recommended to live in poverty and in obedience. You have the idea of the three counsels, the three recommendations for a perfect holy life, which is poverty, chastity, and obedience. So that's why it is sort of a very high ideal to become a monk and live in a monastery. However, it's not the case that all men are called to have that. That's not the vocation for the vast majority. It's rather, it seems that you could say that God has determined that this is perfection, but only some people are called for that, and the majority are called for this more, you could say, earthly life of having a family and raising children and participating in social life. So yes, and also Jesus talks about this in the Bible, that he talks about those who become eunuchs, or however you spell it, for the kingdom of heaven, that is living celibacy. Those who can take it should take it or take it. So it's clear that some people are meant for that position, but many are not. And also we see this with poverty also. Yes, perfection is about living in poverty. Like when that rich man talked to Jesus, what must I do to be saved? Jesus said, if you want to be perfect, you should get rid of all your material wealth. But it's not like every single person in society should live that way, because wealth is a part of the prosperity that the earthly society needs to thrive. So that reflects a bit what you were talking about there, this idea that some people are meant for some positions, but others are not. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a really nice parallel that you have showed here. And I was also reminded of a further parallel. There is a text by Freud, one of his early texts. I don't remember the title. I will put it in the description or in a comment under the video. It has something to do with totemism and the origin of religion. And he basically talks about many tribal or primitive societies and their the way they are organized. And in many of these societies, the chief or the shaman or people who have like a special position, which would kind of be desirable because it has more power or more honor, there is also some very sometimes uncomfortable duties that these people had to perform. And these duties, one could look at it that they are somehow made to balance the scales. So if you want to be a leader of the tribe, then that will be something which is very perhaps feels good for the ego. But for example, the Japanese emperor had to sit perfectly still and not move one muscle for many hours every day, because it was believed that his being still would also lead to stability of the empire. And now you can, of course, smile about this and think it's a little bit naive, but the point remains that oftentimes people who had a position of leadership or of authority at the same time had to renounce bodily pleasures or having a family or these kinds of things.
And in the Catholic Church with the priest, you have celibacy there, and they renouncing material things for the good of the kingdom of God. So yes, that's an idea you could find various places, and also in all Israel in the Old Testament, you have the idea that those who are priests and are sacrificing to God, they are not supposed to have any sexual activity for an entire year. I think there was something like that, because they were going to have this very important position, and there was this idea that to have this holy and sacred role, there should be chastity involved. And you could say that's a prototype of the celibacy of the priests in the New Covenant Catholic Church. By the way, when it comes to circumcision and the Egyptians, I'm not so sure exactly. The idea of circumcision in Israel began with Abraham, and that was the command to circumcise all males. So yeah, and I think the idea was that circumcision, the idea was that would distinguish them from other tribes in the Middle East, among other things. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure which context they're talking about the Egyptians doing the same, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the way I was talking about it was more from a historical perspective of archaeological findings of paintings in Egypt that describe this ritual of circumcision under certain contexts. And of course, there might be dispute about this also, but in my mind, the Bible is not in that sense a historical document that just because it says there that this rite originated at this time and for this reason, that doesn't mean that this effectively was so in reality. But some people would not agree with this statement, but that's the way I tend to interpret it.
Well, I would disagree with that, but perhaps that would be a separate topic. So getting back to the topic we're discussing, it's true that you have this phenomena. It seems to be, according to human nature, that some people are meant for certain positions, thus renouncing certain goods that other people will have. That's sort of the order of things, you could say. So yes, there is this balance and harmony, you could say, that things are meant to obey and follow. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I just briefly, and then I have also another thought. I like also this way you have expressed it from Christianity or Catholicism, that not all people are meant to be perfect or can be perfect, and that the material, the lifestyle that is closer to material reality is also important for a society and also has its value, and that there is a certain distinction of tasks. And I guess this is a very valuable thing, and it's also, I think, was more clear in past societies than it is today, because today, for example, philosophers and priests in I'm not sure in the Catholic Church, but in the Protestant Church, they can also have families and children, or politicians don't have specifically to renounce any pleasures in order to be allowed to become politicians. So we have kind of lost this aspect of balancing the different parts of society to each other, so that each is approximately equally desirable, and then people will just choose the one for which their natural character seems to fit the best. But today, some people think they can have the cake and eat it too, and that leads to a bad consequences. Yes, because people will become greedy.
Right. Yes, and one can trace that error, like you mentioned in Protestantism, back to Martin Luther and other thinkers like him. So yes, it's valuable for society to have this balance, have this harmony, and yes, and this goes back to, generally speaking, the idea of there being a natural order to things, and there being a fitting place for human beings to relate to others in a specific way and live a specific way that would be the good of the whole. And of course, this idea is sadly also denied by much of modernity, which treats things as very artificial, and society as a very mechanistic thing, like a machine. So yeah, that's another thing that has to be changed, because it denies human nature and is incompatible with the testimony of history, among other things. Yeah.
Yes, so I did have a second interesting thought quite a while back in our conversation, but I think it would be an interesting aspect, perhaps like a small second part of this distinction between the material and the spiritual, because a little while back we said that both the spiritual and the material are good, but that they are kind of arranged hierarchically, so that the spiritual should be in control of the material. And so I was wondering if, from that point of view, I'm not saying I agree with it, but from that point of view, the transgender people would actually be right when they say, well, my mind or my consciousness feels like this, and so I will try to adapt my body to the way that my mind feels, because the spiritual would be in control of the material. And so it seems to me that, though I think the spiritual is in control of the material in some way, in some other way also the material controls or affects or limits the spiritual. So it seems like the interaction goes in both directions, but perhaps not according to the same principles. And the same could also be said, of course, of the natural world, where in some way the animals control the plants by eating them, but in another sense also the plants control the animals, because if no plants grow, then no animals can eat them, and then there are also no animals. So there seems to be a different kind of influence from the bottom to the top and from the top to the bottom. So what do you think of all that?
Well, I would say that there being a hierarchical relation between the soul and the body, and more general, does not necessarily involve that the soul imposes or demands or embraces something that is incompatible with the body, because the idea is that they must be united, and still they have to be united, and one being the head of the other, so to speak. But if the head, that which has the primacy, the spiritual, begins to embrace things which are factually incompatible with the body, then they are not properly united. There is a disunity, so to speak. And when it comes to transgenderism, also more specifically, I would say that the problem there goes deeper, also because their perception of their gender being different than their biological gender, the right spiritual conclusion, spiritual aspect being disordered. And if their soul were in the right order, the idea, according to this natural law classical philosophy, would be that they would embrace their true identity as the biological identity that they are. So you could say that their spiritual, their reason, their faculty of intellect and will must also be presiding over their perceptions. So the perception is not sort of the manifest reason, the intellect, and the free will. Those are the parts of the soul which really is that which controls the body. So if there is a situation in which the perception contradicts the reason in the soul, then there is a disorder within the soul itself. And you could thus argue that in order for the soul to properly direct the body, the soul must be in order within itself in order to direct others. So that's what those are two things I would say with regards to that. When it comes to the idea of something being primacy over something else, and yet that which has the primacy being dependent on that something else, like you mentioned, the animals could be said to be have the primacy over plants, and yet they are dependent on the plants for nutrition. Well, one could, I suppose, say that one having the primacy is dependent upon others, but still having the primacy, similar to how a head of states, some political leader in a country, he has the primacy in that country and leads the rest of society, but he's still, in a sense, dependent upon the rest of society. If all the rest of society disappeared, he wouldn't be the political leader anymore, and he would probably die because he couldn't be self-sufficient utterly and totally. So you could say that yes, someone or something having the primacy over others could be still compatible with the idea of them being dependent on these other things. So yeah.
Yes, I think that's really nice. This second part that you said here, I really like that primacy and dependency are compatible with each other, and this seems to me to be, like, at least at the moment, it seems to me to be universally true, that the higher form or the higher entity has primacy over the lower entity, but at the same time, the higher entity is also dependent on the lower entity, because it can only exist when the lower entity also exists in a form that allows the higher entity to emerge or to come into being. So even the plants are dependent on water and minerals and sunlight. So if one of these, and temperature, so if one of these things just goes way out of hand, then all of life basically dies. So the living things are dependent on the material but not living things, and then the higher living beings are dependent on the lower ones, but at the same time they have primacy or control over them. So I really think this is a very, very helpful and nice way to sort this problem out that I have basically brought up here. And to the other point, I also think it's interesting because it seems in a sense, and of course, this is, I think, the Aristotelian notion that, as you said, the body influences the identity of the soul, and also then the soul is in control of the body, or something like that. So even though the soul is more important, also at the same time it cannot exist independently from the body, but it's kind of dependent on the body and cannot exist in a way that is contrary to the nature of this body, or something like that. We might be able to formulate it a little better.
Yeah, well, the way I would put it, as I understand it, is that when you have something leading and having primacy over the other, it must also be unity. That, for instance, just generally speaking, you have the form and the matter in a material thing. The form has the primacy over matter, but they must always be in union. They must always be united. And if they're separated, there is a problem. And also this goes to the first point you were making about that having the primacy could actually be said to be dependent upon that over which it has primacy. So for Aristotle, you have living things like, say, animals. Animals have form, and that is the principle of life. That is the principle of animation, and that is their soul. So just so that the audience also knows, according to the classical way, that classical philosophical understanding, soul merely means that which gives something its life, the principle of life or animation. So when one says, for instance, according to Aristotle, one could say that a flower has a soul, and the soul of the flower is that which gives it life. So that it doesn't mean that it has soul with consciousness as with human beings, but just that it has some principle of life. So just to clarify that. So that soul, that principle of life, would be that which has the primacy in those animals. But that form, that soul, is still dependent upon the body of those animals being there as well. And in animals, if the body is not there, the form, that is the soul, cannot be there either. So they need each other in order to exist. And there you therefore have a great example of something having primacy over something else, that is the soul of animals having primacy over the body of the animals. And yet they're both dependent on each other for their existence. Now, Catholicism makes an exception to the human soul, because it is argued that the human soul contains immaterial faculties, the intellect and the will, which are independent of matter. But generally speaking, apart from that exception, when they have form and matter, they need each other, but yet the form is higher than the matter. They're higher in this hierarchical relation. So yeah, and also another thing about the relationship between the soul and the body, you could say that in a sense it's the soul by necessity is over the body, because it's always the soul of human beings which directs the human body. It's we, our mind, who determines how our body is going to behave. Not completely, for instance, there are reflexes and the fact that, for instance, our heart pumps blood, that happens irrespective of our will, but still, it's still our soul which has the primacy over the body, and that's sort of a natural principle that we have. But then there, of course, also, in addition, is the question of, okay, we have to direct the body in a good way, and there we could talk, and there we have the idea of virtue ethics, being virtuous, etc. So yeah.
Yes, interesting. Yeah, there are 2 points that really interest me from what you have said, which I think was also very valuable. And the one point is just this kind of mixture that in some sense human beings have conscious control over their body, and then at some more fundamental level this ceases to be true, and the body kind of that's there where really the animal part of the human shows itself. So you said, like, the pumping of blood, or the reaction when you get startled, when you get scared. There is a reflexive reaction that just takes place, and the conscious mind only really comes back after this reaction has taken place. Or another example is, of course, the digestion and all kinds of things that happen within our intestines. And also, it's just fascinating because I am going to be a father soon. So a pregnancy is mostly just a predetermined biological process. It's not under conscious control. And also the first actions of a newborn child, they are all just instincts and reflexes. There is no conscious control. This only emerges at a certain point. So I think this is just interesting how the human being is kind of like a basis of an animal, and then kind of a rationality or a consciousness on top of that. That's, I think, how I see it. And sometimes the rationality can take control over the animal part and suppress it. For example, when people voluntarily sacrifice their life for a cause which is important to them. But sometimes it also goes the other way around, and the body can just shut off the consciousness, and people, for example, on a battlefield or during childbirth, just function by instinct, and then at some point you kind of wake up again and the consciousness comes back online after having been away for a certain time. So I think that's one aspect that I find just fascinating.
Right, interesting. Yes, interesting. And first, it's also a reflection of the fact that the body is not an extension of the soul. Perhaps, I am not sure, but there might be some people throughout history who have argued something like that the body is actually just an extension of the soul. But no, the body is some distinct thing. It is not separate from the soul, but it is in itself distinct, even though they are both united and meant to be one whole human being. It has a nature that is distinct from the soul, even though they both are supposed to be united together. So that's also what you spoke of there could be pointed out as a reflection of that fact. Right. Yeah. So I don't have much more comments on this particular point, but what we have discussed so far is at least those are important philosophically, theologically speaking, to understand how things are and to avoid grave and destructive errors.
Yes, I would have one more kind of interesting question, and it's kind of a question of degrees, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. And I would once again come back to the transgender question. because I think, as you said, and I'm kind of just in a thought experiment somehow, or trying to still make up my mind on some of these questions, that you said that a soul that is in the right order kind of has to embrace or accept the nature of the body, so that the body kind of influences the soul by having a certain nature, and the soul cannot, how do you say it, desire things that are incompatible with the body, which I think is, I kind of tend to agree that there is a certain human nature, and this also has to do with the body of a human. This also has a certain nature to it, and somehow it seems wrong or problematic to me to go against it. And so the question of degrees that I wanted to just kind of explore a little bit is, where does the problematic area start, and where is it still unproblematic? Because of course you could argue that human beings have developed very sophisticated tools, and these tools in a sense take human beings beyond what they are naturally capable of. So for example, it has been argued that it's not natural for human beings to travel faster than the speed of a horse and buggy. Or so you could say it's not natural for human beings to fly up in the sky, because else they would have wings. So perhaps planes are an instance of people desiring things with their mind that are incompatible with the body. Or you could say, for example, someone having a rifle which enables them to shoot a bullet very fast is incompatible with the body. Or you could say operating on yourself to change your appearance to look like a woman instead of a man is incompatible with the body. So is there some idea that you have how you can distinguish one of these from the other?
Well, that is a very interesting philosophical issue. And it goes back to how we understand nature and that which is natural. And it goes back to the idea of teleology, that things have end goals or purposes built into their nature, and also the idea of essence. So it goes back to an interesting way to put it, the nature of nature, in other words. So I would say that yes, the body has a nature, so it has certain goals or certain functions that it's essentially meant to fulfill. For instance, it's meant to have energy and blood and nerve signals and other things. Just the entire process of processing food within the stomach, all of that is a function within the body. So when you process food, you digest it, and then it goes through the entire bodily process. That is the body doing what it is literally supposed to do, built in within its very nature. So that is the Aristotelian and Thomistic idea, that there are these faculties, powers, attributes, properties of the body which reveal to us, and we can know this by observation and examination, that there are certain things that are natural for a body and certain things that are contrary to nature. And if one actively does that which is contrary to nature and actively frustrates the natural end, then there is a moral problem. And this is actually a philosophical argument for why, according to the traditional Aristotelian account of morality, things like homosexuality and contraception would be wrong, because according to that view, sexuality is about procreation. That might be a distinct subject, but just that's an example of how this idea of teleology is relevant to various ethical issues. So it's a very, very valuable, these things. And when it comes to things like flying an airplane or using rifles and things like that, they would not be seen as somehow frustrating or destroying some natural capacity or function within the body. You could say that they help them or aid them in something, but they don't contradict something that the body is made for. And another example of this principle might be, take glasses. You could say that the eye has the nature or the purpose of seeing. That's what is natural. But if one uses glasses, that is not destroying or frustrating the purpose of that glass, that eye, but rather simply helping it perform its function of seeing. It's a form of aiding it. And I would put sort of the idea of flying airplanes and owning certain things in the same category in this specific respect, and hence it wouldn't be a problem with regards to the body. However, transgenderism is a problem when it comes to that, because that does contradict nature. And yes, we could perhaps go more into that, but yes, you of course can comment on what I said first.
Yes, thank you very much for this explanation. I think this is really really interesting, and I guess food for thought. But my natural inclination is to agree with it, that it seems really convincing that there is a difference between having technological aids or using the mind to create tools that help the body achieve its natural ends, or using the mind to develop tools that hinder the body from achieving its natural ends. Now, I guess we would have to have a longer discussion about homosexuality and contraception, because I disagree with the Christian notion that sexuality is only or even largely primarily to have children. I think there are two aspects to it, and one of them is having children, and the other one is having intimacy or contact with another human being, which is something that we as social animals seem to need, and that does us well. And so I guess that would be a longer conversation. Perhaps we could have that once. I would like to pose you another crazy question connected to this, because I have recently come across this argument by feminists that we should use technology to free women from the oppression by nature, that they are the ones that have to have children in their bodies, which is a hindrance to their self-expression in the world. And so people of this persuasion would wish for some kind of artificial device in which babies could grow up basically from just the first moment when you put an egg and the sperm together. Then you could just put them in such a machine, and the woman wouldn't have to have this burden of carrying the baby around. Now, I feel kind of an intuitive revulsion from this idea, but it might be interesting to discuss it a little bit, why or what is problematic with this, or if my revulsion is lacking a basis.
Well, many things could be said about that. One thing I would first say is that the entire idea that nature somehow oppresses people doesn't make any sense. And I wonder, what do they mean by oppression? What is oppression? How do they define it? And I cannot imagine how one can define it in a way that is philosophically good and true, because yeah, the nature is built into your inside one's very identity. So to talk about it oppressing you, it's literally talking about you oppressing yourself, which is very impossible. So yes, that notion wouldn't make philosophical sense, I would say. So the idea of using technology to sort of take shortcuts, so-called, to avoiding pregnancy and other things in order to reproduce, that I would say is an example of how nature is attacked and rebelled against, because the very nature of reproduction involves not only conception, but also the growing of a human being within the womb of the mother and then being born. That's the entire function of that womb and everything within that process of pregnancy. So yes, it is to use these artificial devices is to try to divorce reproduction from the aspect of pregnancy. But pregnancy is built in toward the very nature of reproduction. So it's contradicting the entire thing. And therefore, yes, one divorces certain things from its nature, and that's not correct. That's literally immoral. So that's what I would say to that.
Yes, I think good points that you made there, both of them. The idea if nature can oppress someone, I think that could also be discussed in more detail, but your point is interesting, that this kind of seems self-contradictory. And also the second point I think is kind of made very well, that a substantial part of a woman's body is specifically designed, or specifically has the purpose of pregnancy and supporting a child during the first 9 months, and then also giving birth. So this whole aspect of the body would then, it wouldn't seem right to say that you are helping it perform its function, but rather you are trying to make it useless, kind of, because it wouldn't then have anything to do anymore when you produce babies in machines. So it would be a little bit similar to the idea that you could just take cells from a person and mix the DNA in a certain way and then implant it into a embryo in a woman's body, and then you wouldn't have any need of penises and testicles anymore. But that we wouldn't say that this would be helping the function of these parts of the body, but simply to eliminate their purpose, or to try to eliminate their purpose. And that's why probably cloning human beings seems also to be something that goes against this aspect of nature. Whereas, as you said, when somebody wears glasses, then this is not the same thing at all.
Right, exactly. And also another problem with that is that I would actually agree with you that an aspect of sexual activity is actually intimacy between a man and a woman, and that is also completely denied in this artificial process. But it is natural for a man and a woman to have this strong bond of intimacy, and that being connected to them also having children, because then you have this family unit, which is also psychologically bound together. And I think sexual intimacy plays a role in that, making that bond. So yes, that's also another problem with that issue, that both you have the procreative aspect and the aspect of unity and intimacy, and they should all be together. So yes, that is the natural order of these things, and that is what human beings must follow.
Yes, that's an interesting aspect, because I couldn't so far put it in words just rightly, but that seems to me to be part of the problem when you disconnect sexual pleasure from procreation, that you could just then basically say, yeah, well, you can just have intimacy with whomever you please and then produce children with some other people, and it would be completely disconnected from each other. But you can definitely argue that there are reasons why in nature these things are connected together, and that this is actually good that they are connected together. And therefore it wouldn't be a helping of the function to separate them, but actually a working against the natural ends of the body, or of the way nature has, of the human nature.
Right. One could add that it would also be working against the role that the sexual organs play in the act. It's also completely denied in such an artificial manipulation. Yeah, so there are problems that which makes it be avoided, and therefore the natural traditional order based on how things are naturally built in, that is important. That is an important standard, I would say, for judging whether something is bad or good, moral or immoral. Is it in accordance with our natural ends, or does it actively go against it?
Yes, very interesting. I really like this small part here at the end of this larger conversation. I was also just now thinking that in a similar fashion, you could then say that operations like a stomach bypass, or like artificial flavors in foods, would then also be a problem, because they would kind of disconnect your eating from your energy management of the body, of your digestion and all that. So yeah, just as a quick thought here.
Yeah, artificial flavors to make it taste a certain way. Is that what you had in mind?
Yes, yes. So you can basically eat something which is very unhealthy, but it tastes like it would be really healthy.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, perhaps I would say when it comes to food that is healthy, but you also add something that makes it more delicious, that itself is not a bad thing. But if you talk about unhealthy things, that might be.
No, sorry. I would agree, but I was more thinking about, like, for example, I don't know, you can take something and put artificial strawberry flavor on it, and then it tastes like strawberry. And of course, strawberry has certain vitamins and certain nutrients that are good for the body. That's why it tastes well. But if you just produce this flavor and then add it to something which is actually not at all healthy, then it seems to disconnect two things which should belong together.
And when you're talking about unhealthy, do you mean something that is actually bad for the body, or something that might be neutral, let's say ice cream?
No, I mean, ice cream in limited amounts is not necessarily unhealthy, but that's not what I'm trying to say. But still, the point is, when you there are, for example, let's take artificial sweeteners, like these things that taste like sugar, but the body cannot use them. The body cannot digest them, so they don't give the body energy, but they taste as if they would. And so, for example, you have Coke Zero, which tastes as if it had a lot of sugar, but it has actually no sugar. It has some other stuff in there which might be unhealthy or might be neutral. The people disagree on that question, but it seems like you are disconnecting the appetite, or the good taste from the purpose of eating food, which is to give your body things that it actually needs?
Yeah, perhaps I have to think more about it. I at least I think I would partly. I'm sorry, I'd have to think more about it. But one thing I could say is that, and I think this is a principle that you implied, that the purpose of eating is primarily nutrition and things related to that. And then one could say that the pleasure you get from eating is a natural side effect from it. So in other words, the pleasure it's not bad or evil in any way. I think some people who listen to some of these arguments from teleology might object that, oh, are you saying that eating ice cream is bad because it's not natural to eat ice cream? No, because there is nothing within the body whose nature and purpose is contradicted by eating ice cream. It's in accordance with it, and therefore it wouldn't be a problem. So I suppose, since the standard is that there is some natural operation which is actively distorted, frustrated against its end and nature, then it becomes a moral problem. So if one is to investigate whether a specific type of product you're eating, a specific way you're eating, is that good or bad, one has to look for and examine whether there is some faculty or some power or operation which is practiced in a way that contradicts its nature and purpose. Yeah, so that is the principle or standard, and then there's a question of trying to examine that. So that's very interesting. That's how you can actually develop an entire science based on that principle, you could say.
Yes, I think your point is really good, that this is the principle that you shouldn't actively hinder an essential operation of the body. And then you can discuss about each application of this principle in detail. Is this now a case of doing that or not? And there might also be things that are morally neutral, in the sense that they neither help nor hinder an essential function, so they are just kind of neutral. So I guess, yeah, that we might leave the very detailed discussion for now. I just had it as a thought. It was interesting, but I guess overall we have examined this principle basically of what is according to nature and not according to nature, and also the question of how something might relate more to the mind or more to the body, and how the relationship between the two of them is. And I think that was the interesting and valuable part of our conversation, and so we shouldn't get lost in this detail here in the end.
Yeah, I agree that this part of the discussion has been very interesting, valuable, and yes, also to what you said, I would be very open to have a conversation where we might get into the application of this standard towards some of the controversial things regarding sexuality, homosexuality, contraception, things like that. That would be very interesting to dive deeper into. So that is also a very good suggestion for a topic next time or some other time. And yes, the things we discussed earlier also about the relationship between the spiritual and material, soul and body, very valuable, very good. So yes, I would say this conversation in its totality provide powerful examples of how correct philosophy is important, valuable, and good. And if one has correct philosophy, that would be a great guide in one's life and examination of important human subjects, such as how should we live?
Yes.
Sorry if there a bit.
No, you just froze a little bit in the end, but it's okay. I think I got the main point, and I agree that having a correct philosophical framework is really important for one's life, and it can help with difficult questions for which otherwise one is kind of at a loss how one should deal with them or relate to them or prioritize between them. So yes, philosophy is really, I always say that philosophy really has to do with life. It's not some theoretical exercises for people who are very far from life, but it's actually very practical in the sense that it helps to deal with concrete issues in one's own life. So yeah, I would really agree to that.
Yes, absolutely. That's very true.
Yes.
So yeah. Oh, sorry, perhaps there was some delay there because of technical issues.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that's also, I think, a great word to end this week's conversation on.
Which word specifically?
That philosophy is practical and helps in real life.
Yes, I agree. That sums up one of the important principles we have been discussing. So great. So everyone in the audience should think about that.
Yes. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and it, I think, helped me, and I hope it will also help our listeners in some aspects in their life. And I thank you for coming on, and I would wish you and the audience a great weekend.
Thank you, Amos, and thank you for having me on to discuss these topics. We might, and I hope to return to some of these subjects later. There are many things which could be discussed more deeply. But yes, very productive, valuable, great points, important points to consider that everyone should consider. So yes, thank you for the conversation. I wish you and the audience a great Friday and weekend.
Great. See you all soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.